Finally, we close off our first segment with a Fireside Chat featuring our policy keynote speaker, Curtis S. Chin, and PropertyGuru's Director of Strategy, Mallika Gadepalli. Curtis and Mallika will talk about sustainable housing solutions in Asia's megacities post-pandemic and give their personal insights on opportunities for the Asian property sector. Welcome, Curtis, back to Southeast Asia.
Well, thank you. It is so great to be back, I have to tell you. This is my first trip back to the region since February 2020. Can you imagine?
Since the lockdown.
Yeah, indeed. Singapore is such an amazing place. It's so great to be back. I came back for really two big events. One was the Milken Institute Asia Summit, and the other was the Bloomberg New Economy Forum. And I can tell you, there was like a hunger for in-person meetings. So how delightful when I think about the great cities of Asia, that Singapore is really showing the way how to step by step reopen their economies, because really the nations of this region have to do so.
Well, as a Singaporean, I'm really hoping that that is truly the case and that we are really on the path to opening up, all fingers and toes crossed.
Absolutely. As I think about just my last, 7 days here, clearly more needs to be done. I want to have more people come together for dinner. But when you think about Singapore, you also think about the buildings, the homes, the infrastructure. And so how great, again, to see that people are out there. Streets are a little bit fuller. Remember that people have masks right now.
The restaurants.
Restaurants are fuller. There's still just like 2 people eating at a time.
Yeah.
But that will change, and how great that Singapore hopefully will show the way.
Absolutely. Just to take a step back, Curtis, you've also been living in Southeast Asia, or you've been exposed to Southeast Asia for a long time.
Yeah, pretty much.
How has it changed?
Yeah, I'm American. I got Asian face, but I'm American. And so, I've been back and forth between Asia, East Asia and Southeast Asia primarily all my life. And I remember I was with this big government relations, public relations firm called Burson Marsteller, and posted to Beijing in 1995. That was a totally different Beijing.
I came to Singapore in 96.
Oh, that was a totally different Singapore then. Beijing 1995, I remember the funny little things you remember. So we had every winter stacks of Chinese cabbage on the streets. I had a flying pigeon bicycle to complement my little shuttle bus ride to the office, or a tiny loop of a subway. And so for me, when I think about 1995 Beijing, or I lived in Tokyo, I lived in Hong Kong, I lived in Manila, the story for me of this region that continues is one of urbanization.
Absolutely.
More and more people are coming to every city I've ever lived in. And often we'll focus on the megacities. So for example, I've lived in Tokyo, I've lived in Beijing, but the megacities of 10 million people aren't necessarily the big story. The big story are probably those cities of 500,000 people. The story is of cities that are 1 million people.
Yes.
How do the leaderships of those cities, with all the resources of, say, a Singapore or Tokyo, how do they provide people there who are coming for work and opportunity? How do they give them the basic infrastructure to live a better life? That's the story of this region.
Yeah, and in terms of volumes, according to a UN report, we're talking about almost 350 million people living in these cities in Southeast Asia alone by 2025.
Wow. I think about it, I saw the numbers are changing so much. I think there was something like 2030, they're projecting, more than half of this region will be totally urbanized.
Urbanized, right?
And I think it was maybe already, I can't remember when, 2010, way back when Beijing itself, or China, I should say, became more than half urbanized. So that continues this trend throughout the region.
So for us, at PropertyGuru, this is really why we come to work. To house and home these people is really the ambition, to give them guidance with trust, and to enable them to both buy, finance, own their own homes. This is really what motivates us, and is the vision for us, to create this property trust platform where people can actually find their homes in this mass towards urbanization.
It was interesting. So at one of the Milken Institute panels that I went to, it was focused on what they called real assets. And so what is that? Real assets, of course, real estate, but it's also infrastructure. And for me, one of the key takeaways is that even like just what happened in the United Kingdom, COP26, this big climate change summit, they're all about, we need to be green, and of course we need to be. But we also have to, I believe, be realistic as I think about Southeast Asia and the Asia Pacific region. There's a lot of housing stock, office stock that is not green. We need to recognize that some of this are like brown, but we need to work and transition office buildings and homes from that kind of brown to a lighter brown to, who knows, like a very light latte-ish color until it becomes green. Because I don't think it's realistic if we just say we're only going to build green and that's the solution. Because the problem isn't what we're going to build. The problem is what is already here, and how do we get developers, tenants, and others to think through what can they do to move things forward while they live there, while they own that property.
I think that's such a great point. I think you're really making a point, Curtis, about what are the challenges that we face, to sustainable housing in our markets in Asia, in Southeast Asia, and how do we think about them, right? One of the points, indeed, as you've said, is just thinking about buildings and thinking about energy efficiency, to your point, right? And wellness in terms of buildings has really come to the fore in the last few years. And I think when you think about green buildings, to your point, there are many ways that communities, governments, and private sector can really come together to create and shape these initiatives. And I think a great example is at PG, for example, we worked on something called a green score. And a green score is basically a way to both increase awareness about a building's sustainability level by capturing it and indexing a number to it. And you score every building on a 1 to 5 rating based on its public transport score, based on how it fared in terms of sustainability in our PropertyGuru Asia Awards, and also using a BCA certification in Singapore. So we gave this score, and I think what it does is it shows you how you can start to think about this on multiple levels. You can build awareness amongst consumers, you can give them choices to think about this, and at the same time, you can basically increase a community desire to move towards sustainable living as well, right? So we have a consumer sentiment survey that we run twice yearly. And in that, we were really pleasantly surprised to discover that 82% of Singaporeans actually expressed an interest in and a willingness to pay more for environmentally sustainable features like solar panels or energy efficient cooling systems or insulation in terms of their windows and doors. And so I think it gives us a lot of hope for the future to say that there are a variety of ways to look at this problem. Financing is, of course, one. Can governments provide more loans, green loans, not just to developers, but maybe also to consumers, but also just increasing the awareness and the appetite and the desire so that there is more pressure from multiple quarters.
I think what you said is so key. I mean, you began by talking about the index. And for me, what is key is the data. We all want this ideal, beautiful, green, sustainable, resilient world, the sustainable development goals. The key one is sustainable cities and communities. So we have this shared vision, but how do we get there when sometimes it does require sacrifice? And so for me, the challenge is, kind of not just as, Greta Thunberg would say, the blah, 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 but is the real action. So even for fellow citizens or, not a citizen of Singapore, but fellow people who live here, they might say that, but when it comes down to, is it you pay 1% more or you pay 10% more? And you think about what just happened in this world of ours this last 2 years, year and a half with COVID. So we've had people stuck in homes, and we've seen this pandemic underscore the inequality that exists. So that people who maybe might be in a very small home with, to be honest, limited internet access, let's say. How can this family in this small home all be on the computer trying to get schooling? And you say to that family right now, would you spend 10% more to have a little bit of energy savings? And even if you would say, well, the math... It's
going to be a considerable energy savings.
Yeah, but you would say the math says it will be a considerable energy saving, but they might say, it's considerable over 5 years. So how will I pay for that upgrade right now? And so you raise the issue of finance. And for me, one of the great, my own takeaways from the organization I'm with, the Milken Institute, is that we often say you might have the best idea, whether for a company or for a policy, but sometimes it requires capital to take it to that next stage. So if you don't have that capital, that money, it might just stay a great idea. So if I have an idea how to transform your building or your apartment, your home, that's great. but where is that initial money to help me finance that? And so that's where innovation is so key. I know Property Guru that you're involved, of course, here in Singapore, you're in Malaysia, you're in Vietnam, you're all over the place. Are there like interesting insights that you're seeing from some of these markets, what consumers want?
Yeah, you make such a good point, Curtis, because the story is not the same everywhere. And there is a big gap and a big difference in the types of challenges that you see in different places, right? For example, in Malaysia, affordable housing is a massive issue. For instance, in our Property Guru consumer sentiment survey, when we did the survey, 1 in 3 consumers want to own their own homes. There's a very strong desire to own as well, just the Asian mentality, I guess, right? But also about more than half of those surveyed said that they couldn't afford the down payment. Another 40+% said that not having a salaried job or formal employment, because Malaysia has a huge informal employment sector, was a barrier. So, for instance, at Property Guru, when we think about this, we've actually built in various fintech solutions as well, into fintech modules into our platform, in order to help them, for example, give them guidance and help them to decide, help them to filter out homes which are in their affordability. So we ask them a set of questions, a set of financial criteria. We know how the banks assess them. And so we actually able to tell them, what is possible within their affordability. But at a broader level, we're also working with the government, because the government is realizing perhaps a little bit too little and too late, but at least making moves in that direction by committing to investing about 500 million to build 14,000 new homes. In Malaysia. For the people who are in a certain bracket that they've defined. So I think those steps are coming. And Singapore, of course, has been ahead of the curve from the very beginning by building their affordable housing, right? But I think these affordable housing solutions are a hugely important part. And using platforms like Property Guru to improve awareness about them, but also to promote them, and to provide those financing solutions bridge.
That's so key. I think even before our Milken Institute event and this Bloomberg New Economy Forum, I think just a week or 2 weeks ago, Singapore hosted its FinTech Fest. So what is FinTech? So, finance and technology coming together. But it also includes kind of, I don't say a mastery, but really understanding the data. So you talked about the consumer insight. So that for me would be me, the potential tenant, that I want to rent an apartment or buy a house. And the traditional banks will be like, well, do you have any collateral to buy? Or do you have a regular source of income to rent? But again, Asia is so different country to country. Well, what if it's not exactly like that in my place, but the banks look at me the same? So fintech offers the chance to revolutionize, and it helps both sides. So I, the potential tenant, through fintech, can better understand, well, really what can I afford given the history of my salary. But also, I would hope that the owners of the properties also see how great that is, because actually I could expand my universe of potential tenants and have some comfort that, they can afford it. And it doesn't have to be the old style of your credit rating and all, because again, people don't necessarily live like they did in the past. People are moving jobs more. And we saw during the pandemic how sadly so many people either lost their job or had a family member who lost their job or just made less money. And so how do we get someone to have confidence in this world that they're still going to be a good tenant?
That's right. I think you're pointing to another important topic that we actually would love to discuss, right, Curtis, which is inclusiveness. And how a healthy, sustainable city is also supposed to be, or should also be, happy and inclusive for all the participants, right? And how financing is such an important undercurrent of providing that inclusivity. But what is your other experience with inclusive cities and inclusive approaches to creating sustainable cities?
Sure. It's fascinating as I think about kind of my career arc. Like 10 years ago, I sat on the board of directors of the Asian Development Bank. We're clearly like the World Bank, based out of Manila. A lot of focus on issues, of course, of economic growth and prosperity, but we need more inclusive, more equal, more balanced growth. And so then we think through kind of programs. So if you think about different ways that you give people access to housing, take it a step back, to give them better access to housing, maybe they need better access to capital. better access to health. One thing we haven't really talked about is that one of the things that really came clear during this time of COVID was that close relationship between health issues and housing issues. Not just, if I live in a building, I don't want to go in my elevator because I'm afraid that, I might get sick in that elevator. But that whole notion, we need to think about how we live, not just where we live, but how we live, and all the things that go on in the building, the ventilation, the lighting, like kind of like my Chinese American background, I would say the feng shui, all those kinds of other things that should impact the quality of life. And so when we think about inclusivity, I want to make sure that that beautiful apartment, that beautiful home, different price points, but is available to everyone. So I'm not saying, the solution is make everyone equal, but let's give people opportunity. Let's include people from all walks of life and give them that opportunity for a better home, a better place to work. And it's all linked. And I think that came through also so clearly during this COVID period. When you're working from home, if you're actually blessed and lucky enough to work from home, that how you live is also going to impact your outlook on life.
It really accelerated, I think, and highlighted the differences between those who have, large, spacious dwellings and those who don't have the benefits of that. I think in terms of inclusion, there's also sort of racial inclusion that we can talk about. And I think in Singapore, for instance, what we found as PropertyGuru is that in the rental market, there is a little bit of racial discrimination that tends to happen. And so we actually had to we work with the government, but we also work with our agents, and we work with listings to make sure, using artificial intelligence technology, to identify and flag up listings that might have discriminatory language in there. And then we kind of block those listings. So I think just using technology as an effective way to increase inclusion, to identify discrimination,
Absolutely.
I think is also
That's
another
amazing,
very
because
powerful
so often
concept.
we hear about all the negatives that will come from technology, because it does exist, because you're better able to identify and screen people. But so great that there are also examples of how technology can increase inclusion. It's not just about fintech, but as you're pointing out, even looking at ads and how people find people, because sometimes it's subtle. Because I would say that some people, they know the law, so they're not going to break the law. But how do we make sure all those other kind of that gray area also doesn't in a way undercut the shared objective that we all should have, hopefully not just the law, but you and I, that our communities are strengthened because they are more inclusive communities. And kudos to you all, because key drivers in this will be those who shape, rent, sell housing. In the United States, we often would say that really you should spend, like a third of your income on housing, vary by different places and all. But housing is such a critical shaper of one's life, of course, but also one's outlook on life. America, there's many good things and many bad things. I'd say one of the badder things is that sometimes our schools are basically financed by real estate tax. So if you live in a nice area, your school is very good. If you live in a poorer area, your school isn't so great. But we need to change that to ensure, what I call that American dream, but it could be the Singapore dream, the Malaysia dream,
Asian
that
dream.
people can move up from their initial circumstances. We want to make sure that housing isn't one of the factors and barriers for them to move forward.
And I think that's such a great point, because we should also talk a little bit about what you think about and what I would imagine to be a great future for us when it comes to sustainable cities going forward, right? And just taking a leaf out of what you said, for me, for instance, public transport is such an important enabler of both inclusion and strangely enough, extending to things like security. Better public transport, it's been proven, makes it more secure and leads more broadly to just life outcomes, because being connected or being non-connected makes a massive difference to long-term outcomes of children.
Absolutely.
So, just again on PropertyGuru, for example, we've just seen that through how popular our geo searches are, right? It is something that we're constantly
What's a geo search?
upgrading.
What does
So
that
it's
mean?
basically quite simply, in Singapore, it's to search by the MRT station.
Oh, how interesting.
In Thailand, it's to search by the BTS station, right? This is how people search. And if you talk to consumers as well, for instance, in Thailand, that's what they'll tell you. We just have a price range and a BTS that we're nearby. So effective public transport, which I think is very much a feature of Asian megacities, is such a big contributor, and I think really something that we should think about for the future as well, just to create that inclusivity, but that platform for everybody to be able to travel to work effectively, to be able to be connected to the broader city ecosystem effectively.
It's fascinating from my life at the Asian Development Bank. It's this multilateral institution, China, India, Japan, everyone sits on the board. One of the things that I took away from actually my Chinese counterpart on the board was a Chinese saying, which, from way back when, to get rich, first build a road.
First build a road.
And so, you can translate into many ways. It means if you're growing stuff, you have access to the marketplace.
Yeah,
but it's about the connectivity that is so important. So when you ask me about cities, and I think is how they've developed here, the reality is that prosperous cities will also help define whether or not a country is prosperous as more and more people move into cities. And think, contrast, let's say, life in your typical American city and a life in a typical Asian city. America, we have this notion of suburbs.
Yeah.
So in the core city, there's buildings and all people live there. But a lot of people have moved out, maybe because of the schools, they want bigger space. So we have all these houses around the city with often not so great public transport, to your point. And so we've become this car culture.
That's right.
For good, and I would also say for bad. Maybe one day we'll be all electric, but I think right now we're saying it's for bad.
Self-driving and electric.
You got it. So I think your point is so right on target that as we think about cities and housing, it's also the importance of basic services, transportation, energy, water, sanitation systems, because the reality of a changing Asia and increasingly urbanized Asia is overburdened or outdated infrastructure. So one of the main things I do, I work with this private equity fund called Tail Partners, which focuses on sustainable infrastructure. And for me, that has to be the way of the future, not just because the SDG says have sustainable cities and communities, but because of our lives. As we think about our lives, we want public transportation that works. We want reliable electricity. We might take it for granted in Singapore, but I can tell you, my friends in Nepal and elsewhere around the region, it isn't always so certain that you're going to have as much power as you would like. We need to invest in that, but also do it in a way that involves the private sector, that involves the community. Because the solution in how we build sustainable cities cannot be, government will do it. That's just not realistic, because it goes back to the financing also.
Of course, at a very micro level, developers are also making changes in how houses look and feel, right? Because that has changed a lot. So employers and offices are changing their policies about where you can live and work and what offices of the future are going to look like in these cities. But also at a micro level, the Japanese and Hong Kong style, optimize everything so you can have a workspace, you can have a gym, all of that. So it's quite a differentiated story between, again, I think, the haves and the have-nots,
or the
right?
developed and the still developing.
And the still developing, because here in Singapore, for example, what's really popular is much larger houses. So the demand for 4-bedders has absolutely skyrocketed in the last year.
Well, I would say, I think unfortunately sometimes we're all shaped by those movies and TV series from the US where everyone's living in gigantic houses. And cars, and we don't see the consequences of that. But for me, one of the great things about Singapore is also that it's a city-state that continues to learn from its past. I believe even Lee Kuan Yew at one point regretted that they tore down so many historic buildings in its path to this great prosperity that we see around us. And so I think even while I've been here this 8 or 9 days or so, there have been some interesting stories in the paper how they're moving to preserve something, or the government has given some grants. And for me, what's so really interesting is when I look at some of the things that have been preserved, they're from a time when we didn't have air conditioning everywhere. And maybe we've lost some of those lessons about how windows are or how high a ceiling is, because we just assume if we're rich, we're going to have an air conditioner. But how cool it would be if we were rich, we thought we were rich and smart enough to learn from what it seemed like was so good, but actually we didn't see the real consequences of that change.
And I think, we see that move in COVID as well, right? At least for me here, for example, air conditioning use has completely gone to, reduced, because you're not in the office, and at home, you just open the windows, right?
That is so true.
And I think COVID has led to other changes as well for us, right? I mean, in the sense of wellness, for example, recreational spaces and parks, so the use of them, the growth in them, because I think in COVID, at least in Singapore, what I've seen is people have just been out and about whenever they could, right? Just for that mental wellness, it has been so important to work on that. So there's been a real increase in the use of recreational parks and public spaces and the community,
which is
to support people affected.
Such
right?
an important point, and I will say this to developers as well as our government, municipal authorities, is we need to figure out a way to have more green space. I was a kid in Bangkok. I live part of the year in Bangkok right now. Bangkok is often cited as one of those cities that really does not have enough park space. But there's so many cities that don't have enough park space because people want to maximize the real estate value they have.
Exactly.
And so we need to think through that. And I think you're absolutely right that COVID showed us how we benefit from that green space. It's not just an oxygen provider, which is so terrific, but it's an opportunity for people who might live in a small home to have that shared public space that they will benefit from. And so when we think about a great city, it's a great city not just because of all these super duper beautiful skyscrapers. It's that mix of the green and the fancy buildings.
And
That's
it's
so key.
Exactly, and it's the mix of the green as well. So it's like the vertical gardens are a concept now here. And gardens on top of the skyscrapers, and all of this is really starting to be a thing. So I guess, COVID had pros and cons.
Of course, we'd all rather not have had COVID, but absolutely there's some lessons from this ongoing time that hopefully will help shape things for the better.
So on that note, Curtis, do you have any final thoughts to share with our viewers about sustainable living in urban cities, especially in Asia?
One thing that comes to mind, whether it's from my time on the board of the Asian Development Bank or my work with the Milken Institute or just living in Asia, for me, as I travel from city to city, one key message that I would hope people can take away is that even as we look up and are dazzled, let's not forget the communities below. Because too often I feel that divide has been accentuated. Do we really need that next super duper shopping mall? And if we do need one more super duper beautiful shopping mall, let's think about the people that might be displaced. Let's think about the people in the communities around that. So as we look up, I'd say don't forget the community below, because the strength of any city isn't the fanciness of its skyscrapers, it's the resilience of its community. And for me, that was also a lesson from COVID, that we've seen some cities that really struggle.
That's right.
But others, I think India is an example.
Rose to the challenge,
and it was the community that brought that city
forward.
There
was a gap in government action and reaction and response.
Absolutely.
And the private sector and the communities just
came
rose
together.
up.
And when I was at the Asian Development Bank, I probably drove some people crazy because I would always talk about, if we're serious about development, if we're serious about more balanced and sustainable development, we will focus on what I call the 3 Ps. That's people. Again, don't forget the poorest people out there. Planet. As we develop things, let's remember its impact on our environment. And my last P is partnership. That we need to think through, how do we bring together government, the private sector, and civil society if we're really going to have a strong community, which at the end of the day is what is at the heart of a resilient, sustainable city.
Yeah, that's a great framework. I really like it. So it's, let me see, people, planet, and partnerships.
Those are the 3 Ps for responsible development and hopefully sustainable urban development. That's what's so key.
Urban development. Yeah, I mean, I think I completely agree. I think for me, it would be just, all those levels that you can take action at, whether it's at the level of your individual, the level of your company, or what you might be able to do in increasing broader awareness of everybody around this really important topic, or driving to solutions that we're also trying to do at PropertyGuru. I think as an individual level, we've actually rolled out a tracking app for individuals where you're able to track sort of your energy emissions and think about that, whether you're taking the public transport today or not, your usage of plastic, whether you're eating meat. That's a big contributor to greenhouse gas emissions. And then at the company level, really sort of rolling out some of these initiatives as a company as well, about how you dispose of your electric waste and a lot of different aspects, right? And also at a company level, like, PropertyGuru has undertaken a lot of of initiatives in the last year, not just in awareness, but internally within the organization. And then all the way through to the community, you know, what we're doing with the buildings assessment and criteria and the green score. And I think this, in the end, your framework really, really works well because it is all about partnerships.
Absolutely.
Communities working together with corporations, working together with governments to make all of these changes happen and come to life.
Absolutely. As we used to say, or maybe we still say, yes, together we can.
Together we can.
Yeah.
On that note, thank you all to our viewers, and thank you very much, Curtis, for joining us.
Thank you. A delight to be here, and a delight to be back in Singapore. Thank you.
The most prestigious property awards in all of Asia. And featuring PropertyGuru's Managing Director, Jules Kay.
Bear witness to the most exceptional builders, projects, and designs the Asia-Pacific region has to offer.
Welcome to Kohler presents the 16th Annual PropertyGuru Asia Property Awards Grand Final 2021.